African nations relying on Chinese investments may soon face a tough choice under Trump. When Donald Trump returns to power, the ripple effects could throw Africa's quest for stability into chaos, igniting a fierce competition between the US, China, and Russia. Donald Trump's approach is focused on securing US interests, and while his economic focus on Africa might benefit the US in the short term, it could also lead to a dangerous geopolitical struggle. So, here's the big question. Will the benefits of Trump's policies bring long-term stability to Africa, or will the continent find itself caught in a struggle between foreign powers? The answer to this question could shape Africa's future for generations to come. Trump's strategy for Africa is driven by a desire to secure US interests, particularly in military and economic areas. This is rooted in his America First policy, which prioritizes US national interests and economic gains above all else. Take East Africa, for example. Located next to the Horn of Africa, we find the Gulf of Aden and the Suez Canal. But why are these maritime routes so important? East Africa holds great value because it is close to key shipping routes like the Suez Canal. By maintaining a strong military presence in this region, the US can ensure the free flow of global trade and secure access to vital shipping lanes. Plus, Africa's valuable resources, such as cobalt and coltan, can be transported through this region. It is crucial for American interests to maintain military control here. There is another reason why this region is so important, but we'll come back to this later. However, the US relationship with African nations under Trump's leadership is transactional. Instead of working through multilateral organizations, Trump prefers bilateral agreements where both the US and African countries can benefit. Trump wants to use Africa's economic opportunities to help US industries while also strengthening military alliances that extend American influence. These deals might seem good for African nations, offering economic growth and military support, but the end result could be growing dependence on the US and fewer political options for African nations. Therefore, we must ask ourselves, by favoring American interests, African nations may gain short-term benefits, but what does this mean for the long term? Especially when you consider Trump's lack of interest in multilateral agreements, like the United Nations or the Paris Climate Accords, which aims to mitigate climate change and provide financing to developing countries to resilience and enhance abilities to adapt to climate impacts. And here's where it gets complicated. While Trump's approach might appeal to some African leaders, his policies face threats both from within Africa and from other global powers. The first major challenge comes from China and Russia's growing influence in Africa. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has become the leading foreign investor in Africa, funding infrastructure projects, trade agreements, and the development of natural resources. Unlike the US's transactional approach, China's involvement tends to be less politically conditional, offering economic benefits without focusing on human rights or governance. As a result, many African nations prefer China as a partner because it brings economic growth without political strings attached. Russia has also expanded its influence, especially in the Sahel region and parts of East Africa. In countries like Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Mali, Russia has built military ties, offering arms deals, military training, and deploying private contractors like the Wagner Group. As African nations like Niger and Burkina Faso turn away from European powers, especially France, and seek support from China and Russia, the US finds itself sidelined in the competition for influence on the continent. This gets even more complicated because there's a global race for strategic resources like cobalt and coltan, and the US wants access to them. These minerals are crucial for producing electronic devices, electric vehicles, and batteries, making them very valuable in global supply chains. But China has already secured these resources through investments and partnerships with African governments. This puts the US at risk of losing access to these minerals, which are crucial for maintaining its technological advantage. And let's not forget, what happens when African nations resist US influence? Some countries, like South Africa, are already pushing back. South Africa, for example, has built strong ties with China and Russia, while also aligning with multilateral platforms like BRICS. This stance often puts it at odds with US policies. South Africa has also taken Israel to the International Court, which does not align with American interests at all. South Africa isn't alone in this trend. Several other African nations are challenging Western influence, rejecting former colonial powers. As a result, many African countries could turn to new partnerships that better suit their interests and goals. So, what's the long-term impact? If Trump's strategy continues, Africa may face serious challenges. Will these short-term benefits for African nations lead to long-term stability, or will they become trapped in a geopolitical struggle again? From the American perspective, focusing on the strategic importance of East Africa helps cement US interests in the region. We've already mentioned East Africa's proximity to important shipping routes like the Suez Canal. There's another key reason why this region is crucial. By strengthening military alliances in countries like Djibouti, Somalia, and Kenya, Trump hopes these nations can serve as key military outposts in a region seeing more competition from China and Russia. The US aims to counter regional security threats, such as the Houthis in Yemen, who threaten stability in the Arabian Peninsula and the flow of goods through the Red Sea and Suez Canal. This shift in focus comes as the US pulls back from other parts of Africa and reduces efforts to combat jihadist insurgencies. Without strong international cooperation, extremist groups are filling the void. In the Sahel region, groups tied to Al-Qaeda and ISIS have gained ground, exploiting weak governments and a lack of strong military support. This increases instability, creating conditions for conflict and extremism. Trump's willingness to pull troops out of the region may open the door for rebel groups, which puts the population at huge risk. American influence is further strengthened with Trump's emphasis on economic deals, especially in resource-rich areas. This approach helps US businesses gain from Africa's wealth. By fostering direct trade agreements and bypassing multilateral rules, Trump gives private US businesses easier access to Africa's resources, often without regard for human rights or international regulations. You can find a video on our channel where we talk about the dark side of the iPhone 16. However, this could pull the continent deeper into a rivalry between the US, China, and Russia. Many African countries depend heavily on Chinese investment and infrastructure projects, which might divide Africa as it faces competing powers in the global race for resources, military influence, and strategic alliances. But what happens if African nations resist US influence? Trump may use financial aid to pressure African countries into following American interests, but this could backfire. Countries like South Africa, involved in BRICS, and nations like Niger and Burkina Faso, turning away from the EU, might reject further American influence. As Africa seeks greater self-determination and forms new partnerships, especially with Asia and the Middle East, it could reduce its dependence on Western powers. Fortunately for Trump, his approach may be welcomed by authoritarian leaders who prefer his transactional, no-strings-attached approach. In countries like Rwanda and Uganda, where governments are criticized for their authoritarian practices, Trump avoids confronting these regimes. Instead, he offers them military support, diplomatic backing, and profitable trade deals, which strengthens their hold on power. This may create environments where civil freedoms are restricted, dissent is silenced, and democratic institutions stay weak. This makes it harder for African nations to build stable, democratic governments. With Trump's second term yet to start, we'll have to wait and see how it all unfolds. Make sure you subscribe to see what will happen next.